recently. So hang on, I'm going to restart this. Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Friday, October 7th, and today we're going to be talking about the return of the mother of all charts. For those that aren't aware of the mother of all charts, it's on the screen right now. This was a video and a chart that I put out back in roughly April's when I sort of started piecing it together and then eventually put out a video for it. There was a lot going into it, and I called it a culmination of a lot of things. And as you can see, I expected to see a very wide broadening occur, right? And basically the principal thesis of it was that you essentially have fractals, which are nested iterations, right? Repetitions that are within themselves that shrink to a certain point and then they start to expand from that point. And my theory was that this particular point in roughly around January 28th was the final shrinking point and that you were going to start seeing an expansion. Well, I abandoned that idea not too long after this, obviously, because when we came down, we saw another version of it, another shrinking version of it. And what's really curious about it is that I actually had, to an extent, predicted a bottom for this. The bottom itself, it looks like, it says 1020, but the bottom itself actually was predicted at being either this like mid-9 region at the time, or this low 5 region at the time. And we had, as you can see, actually a pretty good understanding of what we should expect in this downward move. The problem is, and then you can tell, I was obviously way too early. And I was using a lot of theories about timing back then that I don't use anymore. I was also considering things such as the executive orders and stuff like that for collateral. All of those things didn't end up panning out as strong catalysts. And in addition to that, there were some other stuff here, such as these trends that just didn't seem like they were working out. So I just sort of left it alone and I got rid of it. And I said, you know what? Didn't work out. I'm okay that it didn't work out. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe it's not done. And I ended up changing my ideas a little bit to say that, hey, I think it continued to shrink down. We still saw another bounce and iteration from here. We saw a bounce and iteration of these two guys next, and then again, and then finally it stopped. And so I changed the idea that, okay, we really weren't at the bottom over here, and we were still going to make a lower low. As soon as we made a lower low, I knew we were not done shrinking, and that's pretty much what caused this to be thrown out the window. And I was still kind of holding on to the idea that this could be a pretty fast spring here in this region, but ultimately, that's not what happened. So I stopped referring to this chart. I stopped really worrying about it until recently. Now, there are some interesting things we can kind of glean looking back on it. You can tell that the main purpose of this was, again, to talk about that shrinking. And I use S-curves, and the S-curves that I used were as follows. You can see them. And they are getting smaller and smaller and smaller as you come down into that January 28th region. And then my idea was that every time you hit the bottom of an S-curve, there's a bounce. And that bounce actually takes you to where that next S-curve kind of starts its bounce, and so on and so forth. So you have like a repetition of 1, 2, 3. And then the main fractal that you're studying is actually right here. It's kind of like the crux fractal, and it defines everything. And that's how I was looking at this guy, right, basically from the top when we were at March 29th all the way down through April and eventually down to May 12th, as a repetition of the sequence that occurs essentially in the first couple weeks of February here. That this was the exact same fractal sequence. And to this day, I still think it is the same. But what happened, right? What changed? Why did it change? How come we went down instead of going up? Well, I think the biggest answer to that question is probably just, hey, the market's sour, right? So it didn't happen the way we thought it would happen. You'll notice, like looking back on it, you can see that even though I was wrong, about where this would occur, it actually wasn't that off. And I'm not going to be able to show you very easily with the way my charts are set up, but the way in which this comes down eventually, right, is actually exactly what we're experiencing right now. The problem was, why did it stay so low? Why didn't it go ahead and break out right, on this widening, why didn't it break out? Well, part of that is because I think that the bottom changed. And we talked about two different kinds of bottoms over the last couple weeks. There's this kind of a bottom, which is pretty common on AMC. I still think that in a manner of speaking, this is similar to what we're experiencing, but it's obviously not the same. If this were the case, you would have bounced in, your bottom would have swung down, you would have springed out here, and you would have continued upward. This is a bottom that you see frequently on this stock. It's all over the place. I'm not going to go into like a million examples right now. But one example for that would be essentially like this guy over here back in August, okay? So that's one example of it. This bottom can change very quickly into this type of bottom if on this sell-off, or on this lower sell-off, right, you get another up thrust, but it does not break out. So basically when it gets to this point in time, right, it goes down, and it can continue to go down, and it can basically be at a falling angle, a number of things, right? And in terms of a range, it can look like separate ranges even at times. We've seen like many examples of this in recent days, many examples of this in recent days. They're not always this clean and horizontal, but that's the way the fractals play out. Not surprisingly, it's basically a series of two cat ears that form a larger cat ear. So you've got a set of cat ears here and here, and then they form a larger one, right? That's a falling one. And when you get to the end of it, as long as there's kind of like a shrinking iteration of some kind and you bounce back up and you reclaim that previous support, then this becomes a large spring. In this particular example, there can be a spring or there can be no spring. And this is really the most common example of what we've seen. This is basically just your master sequence, right? And you can tell how and why I think they're so similar because they are. You know, you basically have like the drop in here. You run up, create a high, you come down into a bridge, you run up again. Sometimes if it's ascending, you might make a higher high. Sometimes you make a lower high. It just depends if it's descending. You come back down to wherever you're going to spring from. Often it's like a center liquidity mark. In this case, you know, it was like right here, that center liquidity, and then you spring and you leave. Some people have said this looks like a crab bottom. It's not a technical crab bottom if you look up the definition of it. But it is one that, you know, could present itself that way at times. I look at it as basically just the fractal sequence. Like it's exactly what we've been looking at. It's in terms of the shapes. It's quite simply, it's just the M shape. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's really, really basic. So it makes sense that this would be a bottom that occurs frequently. And the only major difference between the two, again, and this is really important before we start talking about everything else, is that when you drop in here, the only major difference is that on this particular kind of bottom, this actually forms high, right? This comes low, and then when it's coming out here, it does not stop, and this goes up and immediately forms like an SOS. That's really the only difference. Now, that looks significantly different. Yeah, sure it does. Of course it does. But they're actually all made up of the same parts. So the location of these in sequence ends up being the same from like a visual standpoint. All right. In terms of where they're placed, according to liquidity, they're not the same. So we'll come back to this stuff later as needed. But for now, I'm going to talk about why the mother of all charts has come back. So remember, the idea of the mother of all charts was these sequential S-curves coming down. And I kind of abandoned it. And y'all are looking at this like, what? What is this? This can't be important. You know, this can't be what you want me to look at today. Yes, it is. This is the new mother of all charts. It is very weird looking. I'm going to explain it. So hold tight. It'll be okay. I promise every single one of these lines matters. All right? Or they wouldn't be here. Basically, I have it color coded. If you look at all of the red, that is like all together. If you look at all the green, that's all together. Yellow is all together. I didn't go smaller than that because I didn't want people to get super confused and aggravated because I know it's confusing. All right. But here's the gist of it. Okay. You have an S curve that's married to a C curve. All right. So if we look at this, I'm going to increase the size of this as I talk about it so you can see what I'm talking about a little bit better. So you have an S curve that goes down. It's married to a C curve. Anytime you have a C curve, all right, almost anytime you have a C curve and an S curve paired together, there's usually more than one. So in this case, one of them is very, very high. It's actually right here. All right, and the other one is very, very low. Same with this guy. There's actually one that goes pretty high, right? So if you're looking at this green guy right here, there's one that goes pretty high and there's one that goes very, very low. And the one that goes low actually ends up being met later on, you know. And we could do it like this, right? It actually ends up being met later on because what it is it's basically bullish momentum that's pulling the stock towards a future high. And interestingly, as they're doing that, they're setting up levels that they're going to retest. So of course they're retesting the bottom here. That's pretty clear and evident, right? Just like in up this region, you're retesting like a bottom before you break down, that kind of stuff. Okay. What's fascinating is that these curves, right, end up actually being really, really important. Here's an example. So in this case, it swoops outward, and when you get to the final place where you break out, the distance it travels away from the curve, not coincidentally, ends up being essentially like 50% of the entire move. So as it pulls away, it's like a slingshot, right? The distance it pulls away from the curve ends up being the distance it travels above the curve. And this occurs repeatedly on AMC, like all the time. It's very fascinating, really cool. If you pay attention to it, you'll see it all over the place. You start noticing stuff like that. Like right here, this guy also has a 50% mark pull away and then above, right? It's very fascinating. And if you look at where it would have met that curve right here on this angle, the distance it pulled away is the distance it went above. Pretty neat stuff. So anywho, at this point, it's safe to say that yes, there actually probably is a curve on this top guy, just like there's a curve here. And this curve on this big guy could be pointing to a future target way off in the distance. Now, am I going to sit here and try to figure out how to chart that curve and like make these wild, crazy predictions as to where I think, oh, I think this curve is going to be here, there, or whatever? No. I mean, you could try it pretty quickly, just doing something like that, and you could do your best to try to make this fit like as many of the possibilities as you can. Ultimately, there's just too many factors involved, too many touch points involved, that it becomes basically impossible, right? Do I think this will be hit eventually? Probably, probably. Right now, I've got the price target sitting at around 100, but it could be much higher. And you can see that, sure, like 100 fits the bill. We get there later, everyone would be like, yeah, it totally happened, Well, why did you bring the mother of all charts back, right? Well, here's what happened. On stream, I was screaming like a little girl, basically. Patrick and I had been comparing notes about some things, and we were talking about how this section here with these cat ears coming down is very similar to the way this guy comes down. And suddenly, like, it just dawned on me that when I was originally talking about the mother of all charts, I showed you that video. Remember I said I thought this section was playing out larger? Well, a lot of people would have agreed with me and still agree with me about that. They would have said like, well, yeah, I could see it. You've got a bouncing bottom, and then you obviously have it kind of cascade down into this crazy looking V shape, and then it pushes back up. And if you look at the fractals much closer, I've got them really big here. It actually pans out pretty well. And when we went to this bottom, I actually was anticipating this guy. So I thought we were going to hit high here and bounce out. Instead, we went way low, but I still said at the time I was anticipating that bounce, right? And then the shoot up and then the drop down, the S-curve down. Well, did that happen? The answer is yeah, I think it did. And then it happened again, but really, really small. And that's why I thought this was kind of like the final place in the middle. All right, so what does that mean about the mother of all charts? Well, if that's the case, then when you look at something like this and you see that on the backside, and you look at something like this and you see that on the front side, then all it's really missing is like what's going on in the middle here. And suddenly it just dawned on me that there was a curve that I drew a long time ago that was really heavily respected, and it was this guy right here. And if you've been with me for a long time, you probably remember this curve because it was one that I had it on the charts for a really long time, and then all of a sudden we hit it, and everything was like, whoa, like that was like super respected. Like it came out of nowhere, This was a chart that I had this curve, this like green curve that you see right here. I had it on the chart for a while, and then when it came up here and it smashed against it, I was like, wow, that curve was super important. And that's crazy. And then it followed it through. Okay, so what? So I remembered all of a sudden that I actually had another curve that I drew on that mother of all charts video. And you guys just got to see that. That curve went up this direction, didn't it? It was a very steep curve. Yeah, the way that I drew it, it was pretty steep. And it just sort of dawned on me that I deleted that curve, right? Because I was like, it's not right. I don't have that curve. It didn't pan out, the way that I thought it would. So I was like, I don't have that curve anymore. And then it dawned on me that I'd actually done another chart video and all this other stuff. And all of a sudden, like, my brain just kind of clicked. And I was like, wait a minute. I did have that curve. I had a curve that went down through here and that ran up right beneath this guy. It just went high, it went too high. It like kept going up, right? I had it going like this instead of coming down. And so the thought occurred to me that like maybe I should revisit the mother of all charts. And all of a sudden it was like, whoa, what in the world? Why did I ever get rid of this? Because suddenly all this stuff sort of started clicking and shooting and firing off in my brain. And what I found is that the mother of all charts never actually died. Like, it did not leave. It persisted. And not only did it persist, but it actually formed a stronger case, in my opinion, for that upside target that we're looking at, because as it moved forward, even though it went down here, it maintained everything that you would look for. So I started to rechart it on stream, and I did this live, and this is what I came up with. And basically all it is again, it's the same thing. You have an arc downward, and where that arc finishes, you bounce outward. And then that's where that arc finishes, you bounce outward, and then so on and so forth. So all I had to do at that point was to draw all the S-curves, which were easy, because I already had done those, right? All the inner arcs, which were also easy, because I'd already done those. So what remains then is the bounces. And the bounces is what really threw me off, because originally, as you remember, that bounce that I had went really high, right? It would have bounced up to here, and this guy would have appeared up top. That didn't happen. We went down for a lower low. We formed that second type of bottom, the one that sits very, very low, right, and doesn't come out until it's ready to go. Well, here's that line that I drew, that bubblegum pink line that I drew, right, way back in the day. And notice where it's at now. It's intersecting, like, it's basically intersecting exactly, okay, on that bottom. And I find that to be an incredibly compelling and interesting thought, because clearly at the time I got it wrong, and everybody would say that. They would have been like, oh, you got it wrong. Here we go. There it is right there. Oh, you got it wrong. It's where we landed today. Now, do I think that it can't come lower? No, because it's come lower before. The point is, amazingly, perhaps, somehow, without even knowing it, I managed to predict where that bottom might end up being, like way in the future. The timing of it was way wrong, but it ended up landing, along that line. And I even thought it was going to pass through it back then. So what's fascinating is that as wrong as I was, there were parts of that ended up being really true. Well, the longer I stared at this and I started looking at this bounce, I was like examining how this bounce works, right? And here's what I found. This is the basic structure that's going on, right? So you have, basically, you have two curves, one that comes down, one that comes up, one that comes down, one that comes up, one that comes down, one that comes up. They're all flattening out. So the extremity of them is getting flatter. So this is the first curve that comes down and the first curve that comes up. And this marks the top of what? The top of your bounce area. Here's the second curve that comes down and the curve that comes up right here. This moves the top of your bounce area, and then you come back down. When you come back down along the curve, you actually come back down in an S-curve. So each one of these has an S-curve fall off. So here's one of them right here. You can see it. Here's two right here. You can see it. And then we are experiencing numero 3 right now, and you can see it. Not only that, but each one of these that comes down also does so in a shrinking iteration. A shrinking iteration means you have a shape that's repeated over and over again. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, typically on lessening volume. And when it finally finishes, such as the case of this shrinking iteration right here, you typically get a pretty large move to the upside because that iteration, the whole point of it is, again, to get you back or to get liquidity, and once they're done getting liquidity, then it's over. They move back up. So the idea of an iteration pushing down, getting smaller and smaller and smaller, is to comb liquidity repeatedly until you basically get to the end. You repeat the same pattern over and over and over again until you get to the end. Each time the range shrinks, and therefore you're getting closer and closer to your target bottom. You've completed it. You now satisfy the liquidity, so you exit, and every time it's always the opposite of the way that you're iterating. Like we had an iteration that went up this direction to here, and it broke down. Then you have an iteration that goes this direction, and it breaks up. Now, price targets for those iterations, a little more questionable. But the point here is that in the mother of all charts, you can see that that's the structure, right? And it's the same structure I observed before. So I went back and I looked at it, and I said, okay, well, where would that be in our current time frame? I'm going to talk about this line in a minute. But first, I just wanted to point out that the bounce is there. So it didn't look like it at first, but the bounce is there. And if you notice how each of these is kind of spreading, right, differently each time, and how they're moving, which direction they're going, the arc is getting flatter each time. The arc is getting less steep, more flat. The arc coming in is also getting less steep, more flat. And then, of course, the arc upward also less steep, more flat. Each one of those is consistent with the pattern. I looked at where the bounce should be. I noticed that there was clearly that arc there, and voila, it's very much so there. I mean, it's pretty darn clean too. Now, these arcs obviously intersect different things, but that arc to me is like really, really clean. The lower arc, I believe, is more of like the center mark here, and it's definitely there. Definitely there. No doubt about it in my mind. This arc exists, right? It's the momentum of this entire move right here, right? And it goes back to where this begins. Now, you might say, Booksy, it could just be the sine wave arc. It is. I think it's one and the same. I don't think it's meant to be distinct. And that's the thing, is like all of this stuff by itself would not make any sense. It needs to be coupled with everything else that comes with it. Otherwise, I don't think it does make sense, you know? Then I started looking at things like trajectories. So what I was doing is I was measuring trajectories in and trajectories out. Trajectories in, trajectories out. And you can see 83 degrees, negative 83 degrees, they match. Start looking at the trajectories of this guy, it's pretty dang steep, and the steeper trajectory is actually the one that gets picked as the main trajectory. So the last iteration here, the last major iteration here, the third one, if you will, the last one, is the one that gets picked. That would be the current iteration, which is, well, very steep, right? It's basically like this 80-degree iteration right here. And I haven't even put it on the chart yet. I'm doing it right now, and I'm like, yeah, that's super, super steep. So an 80-degree iteration could be possibly the last one, right? And if it is, then what you're going to see potentially, here, I did it upside down. I have to redo it. What you're going to see potentially is a move that really follows more strongly along this particular marker. So that's one part of this puzzle. The second part of the puzzle is, where does it spring, right? And where does it go to? Because those are really, really important. Well, I started noticing that if you take just a simple line, right, and you draw that line to the top, that they actually intersect pretty well, right, with some of these other trends. And the main thing is they intersect, you know, in a particular way, these different trend markers. I went through and I did it a few different ways, a few different times. I tried to determine what would be the best way to do it. And essentially what I came up with is that there are multiple points of interest, but the main one that you want to concern yourself with comes from this bottom, passes through, you know, these regions, and then ultimately ends up where you end up. And this is sort of more speculative. There's not really a lot more evidence beside that. But what I found is that basically when I shot this line up, this particular guy right here, that reaches through this top, so I went from this bottom to this top, that it intersects perfectly. Where does it intersect perfectly? Well, it intersects perfectly this particular downtrend. Now, if this gets to 596, this is the direction it would go. This would be your speed line down. And the speed line out here, 55, negative 55, where does that intercept? It actually intersects at the all-time high. So right now, there is a very clear trajectory line, right, that's being mimicked here and then pushed out here that goes all the way up to the all-time high. Okay, Booksy, but that seems a little bit far off. It seems like it's next year. That seems way too far. Well, my theory has never been one of convenience for people. I don't look at this as like it's going to shoot straight up. And remember, like, I believe in like a master fractal sequence. So I know that sounds kind of weird, but basically I believe that everything has to finish, right? And that you need the other part of it. You need this side, right? And it might manifest in different ways at different times. And yeah, if this shoots straight up and goes to the moon, I'm not going to be mad about it. I'll be happy. But that's not what I'm expecting because I'm still not seeing any kind of a break above the major trend line yet. Therefore, I still think that we're not in a sequence where, you know, you're basically looking at, well, what did I just say? You're not actually looking at a macro breakout here. You're looking at this region, right? Because I think we're in the bottom area still. I don't think we've broken out. So I think we're doing this right now, basically. All right, for lack of a better word. Now, again, if it turns out we're over here in the grand scheme of things, in the bigger picture, fine. The point of this, though, is that you can obviously see, it's very, very clear to me anyways, that you are finishing where you should be. Like, you should be seeing at the second half of the M, right? So if you look at the big picture, the second half of the M should look like this. All right, this is this side, right? So if you're right here in this region, this is the second half of an M shape. Therefore, this area, oddly as it sounds, as it looks, I know, and maybe it's extended quite a bit. It's hard to say. Maybe it's more like this. You know, I don't really know for certain, but it should look like this whole right half. It should look like this whole right half. It's always going to be that right half. It should look like this whole right half because they're all the same. They're all the same part of the same. They're all the same sequence, okay? That's just the way that it is. That's the way fractals work. Well, you can tell why this makes a lot of sense then, because if you look at this region specifically, we got this type of bottom. We got the main push up here, right here. We sold off hard, right? You got that kind of rounded bottom down here. You got the second push up, number 2. Another iteration, another one of those fractals that looks like it's doing this thing, right? Or kind of peers out sideways and then drops. You get the choppy bottom, and then finally, you get the final iteration where it pushes up, goes sideways here, right? Drops hard. That's exactly what's happening right now. And not only that, but it's a shrinking iteration. So not only that, but it's a very clear shrinking iteration of itself in a falling wedge. And possibly in like a beak formation. We don't know yet. But we essentially have like a number of bullish explanations here that all point to the same thing, that all point to the same finale, right? They all point to this kind of a this kind of an end, right? No matter what's going, no matter where you are. And I think we're in Mark 6, I do, on the macro. And I think that even if we weren't, like, this is where we are on the micro, Mark 10. So you're going to get some significant upside. When you start looking at this in combination with this mother of all charts concept, all of a sudden things to really start clicking into place. You've got the arc up, you have the S curve down, It absolutely this matches this. Yes, absolutely. When you get to the very end here, there's some really steep drops that get you to where you want to go, and then you get the bounce out, right, at a similar angle, and then all of a sudden it's like pushing hard, okay? And the more you look at this, the more you start seeing how, okay, well, there were clear like inverse head and shoulders here. Here's one, right? Here's another. And then when it gets to the end, obviously it failed, and then that was the end of it. Well, you have that same setup right now. You have a shoulder here, you have a shoulder here. And I've been going through this and looking at it over and over in different ways. The more I look at it, the more I'm pretty convinced that this is not only not only setting up just like this, but it's quite possibly much steeper. Like, quite possibly it's much steeper. It's possible. And a lot of it has to do with the last several days, the nature of this push down, the fact that there's such low volume coming down. And the volume over here was considerably higher, right? The selling volume at times. And so I find it to be very compelling right now that this is setting up so steeply. And I do totally expect there to be a final kind of like push up with that, secondary pullback. Just like we had here, there might be quite a bit of chop, a lot of series of up thrusts, right, followed by like pullbacks and all that stuff. Till you get to the very end, you have a nice, pretty significant pullback. And then, of course, at that point, you're talking about a move, considerable move, probably to meet very closely with the speed line. And ultimately, like, where does it go? Well, you can see here that this guy pushed all the way back up to SOS. And it pushed up to SOS at the top of the range, didn't stop on here. And where would that be for us? Well, I think it would be potentially like way up here, but I also think that it's possible that we see one more shoulder there, right? Something like this. I know I've drawn it kind of wide here, but see one more shoulder here before we go up and we finish our SOS. And that would make a lot of sense. And if you actually want to, you can zoom in. And you can see there's a trend right here that should be respected in the future. So it's basically building itself, right? I mean, it's not even that difficult to sort of understand this. It's essentially like creating its own path here. And when it finishes, when it completes, it should be fairly significant. It should make some pretty big moves here. And ultimately, what we want to see is we want to see this come up and SOS and move out. Now, the widest angle I have here, the intersections seem to be way out here in like December, all right? But as you can see, the up thrust here goes significantly beyond it. And I really do think that what we're looking for is some kind of a quick inversion right here. Yeah, and then we're going to see something along the lines of an SOS in this area and then a final push up. Now, this push-up could occur as early as December 14th or whatever, but ultimately there's still a lot of inflection points that go straight to that December 19th area. That is where the sine wave was, and the sine wave intersections was right there. As you can see, there's also a couple other really important lines that I'm looking at right now, and these would be the macro and sort of like the super macro, if you want to call it that, arcs. So I went and I tracked an arc through here, right through the center, right where it's whipping around it. Yeah, especially with this region. And where this comes back to, if you go back to the same price target, right, which is our main price target that we got from both the diamond bottom and the double bottom, like the initial price target, okay, is you actually come back to this like 28 region, and that arc is playing out really, really well. And you can tell that if this were to follow through like we think it does, it actually makes perfect sense, because it not only does it come right back, right, to regain its arc in strength, but it breaks out of the downtrend, and this ends up being like a really significant move, because if you look at where the 50% marker is from where we are now, and you can go a little bit lower, it's basically that price target. So the whipping around here would be very significant. So the way I've drawn it might be a little misleading, because it looks like, oh, you doesn't look like you get much higher than that. No, like it could potentially be much higher, like way up to here before you experience a pullback. Now, I'm not going to talk about these two different options today. They're very distinct from each other, and there's a third option here as well. That's neither here nor there right now. I don't think it would be very prudent to talk about it at this moment. It's important, and I think it has a lot to do with where you think we are in the major sequence. But I went ahead and also made a much larger version of this, And what I did is I used obvious kind of trends here, but I tried my best to sort of match it up as best I could and do it in a way that's similar to this one. So it goes again from peak to peak. And this is what I found. And once again, it intersects. They actually both intersect in the same region. It would make a lot of sense to me to have this kind of come back during that December 19th area and make the decision here, whether it's going to continue up to an all-time high, which, by the way, again, we know that this points to. And another thing that's really crazy about all of this, you remember that trend line that I said, hey, that's like an inverted trend here, this guy? Well, this is where things get pretty wild. So this trajectory, you guys are like, this is already really confusing. I don't know what you're talking about. This trajectory right here is the inverse of this trajectory. And it is also in line with this trajectory. So you see how that's 61 and this is negative 61? Well, this comes back from this top to this bottom. Coincidence? It could be, I suppose. But I find it to be very, 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 very compelling and interesting. So the fact that those are set up in such a way that they're mathematically really solid doesn't mean it has to happen that way. But we do know that typically the entry and the exit of these bottoms has identical trajectories. So the entry trajectory should be the same as the exit trajectory, and that's exactly what's being set up with this pullback right now. It's setting up like a perfect mirror right here to match the entry trajectory that we got in this region, which is pretty incredible. Now, there are a couple other things I could talk about. I've already gone really long. This video is bizarre, I know, because a lot of people are like going to watch this and be like, I don't understand a word he's saying. He's talking about all his language. Like I said, there's that YouTube you can watch. In terms of price targets and timing, that's really what everybody wants to know. Basically, October would be a very big month. And going into December, you'd probably see some sideways action. And then from there, yeah, all the way up through about December 19th, or maybe even earlier, more like December 14th, possibly, you see some pretty big moves up. There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that this particular move right here would take a lot of time. It would basically about the same amount of time as this, a couple weeks or so. And that would be it. And then the rest of it would be predominantly some strong upside with some significant pullbacks. So even this guy right here could be very significantly fast, right? Push up to like almost 30 and then pull back pretty hard. And that's what I'm sort of expecting going into December. I know that there's this intersection here. There are some suggestions that maybe you would go sideways here. But I do think it's more likely going to come back and retest this top. This is a top that doesn't seem very important, but I'm actually finding it to be more and more interesting as time goes on. I think it's going to be very significant for where this sets up in the future. Obviously, I also think that this guy, which is like a major supply right now, would need to be where we kind of create a major LPS, or and you want to call it an SOS, that's okay, but just a major sign of strength, an LPS. And then ultimately, yeah, up here. But I don't even expect this to be necessarily that grandiose. So I do think you're still going to get a push up and a pretty significant pullback. This is going to be a chart that I use pretty frequently in the future. The last thing I want to talk about are these boxes and this particular blue line. Now, this one's weird, but basically I noticed that there was a connection between the first spring that occurred down here. Now, it's hard to see. Zoom in a bit. You see this little yellow triangle? Well, this is the very first spring, right? So after the first bounce, you got this bottom. And then after the second bounce, you got this bottom. And you're kind of noticing, hopefully what I'm already going to tell you, is that they seem to appear on a pretty interesting trajectory line. Like, it's kind of clear that they both are testing underneath the same kind of level. Well, I went and I looked and I thought, well, if that's the case, then what is this, right? And this guy actually does come beneath it a little bit. And I was like, okay, I think it's there. I think this is all that information. What's confirmation to me about this is the fact that this is a shrinking iteration down to here. So this point, this point, this point. There's like 3 really easy to see consecutive iterations. And we have the exact same thing. Here we have the bounce and up thrust, bounce and up thrust, bounce and up thrust, and then it's over. right around there. Actually, it's all together right here. It's really small. So both of these have the exact same model, right? One just comes really low. So you have the yellow triangle and the yellow rectangle area that is shrinking iterations. You have the yellow triangle, right, on the bounce, on that side of the bounce, the right side of the bounce, and then you have this. And then you should have a blue triangle. And lo and behold, that's kind of what we're forming right now, is a gigantic triangular formation, possibly, right? Everything's set up for it anyways. If it takes advantage of it, that's what would happen. What's even crazier is if you look at where this triangle is setting up, it's so far at this point. It's so far, and this might be a little like high. I don't know. I think it's pretty dang close. Look at where this guy hits. It hits right on it, and it's crazy to me because this particular line is this trend. That if you draw a trend from the bottom on August 10th through that top on the 22nd, that's not like a horizontal, it's a diagonal. And that diagonal takes you right back through where this cat ear support was, and not coincidentally where these two bounces are. And so what's even crazier about it is if you imagine all of this stuff right here on the right side occurring, and by the way, this is a series of inverted head and shoulders. We counted them out. There's like 5 on each side. It's wild. There's like 5 on each side right here. If you were to do the same thing in this region, you could see where the inverted head and shoulders are. So what's even wilder to me is that these series of like up thrusts and moves upward might be like humongous. And then notice where this SOS goes. It goes way up, right? Now I'm not 1,000% confident that's the way it's going to happen exactly that way. I think it's more likely going to stop here and pull back. But I will say this, it's a pretty compelling case. And the more you stare at it, the more you're like, well, I mean, if it's a series of head and shoulders, right, that comes up and forms an SOS, then perhaps, right, your SOS is right here with this guy. And then you really just see a big move to the upside after that. It's very possible. I'm going to be studying it more and more, but I find that to be very, very significant. Unfortunately, it does lead you to this idea of a possible downside here, because you'd have to look then at what happens if this doesn't go that high, you know, so on and so forth. Where would it go next? But I think the general consensus should be that notice where this guy comes up to retest. I believe it's going to be either right around 28 or right up to 32. That's where the next test should be. So you should see a pretty clear move, and that's what's even crazier is if you look at where this bottom is and you look at where we're going, possibly up to $32. Look at where the 50% marker is right now. It's right on the money. It's right where it should be, right on that intersection of that downtrend. It's incredible. It's perfect. It's exactly what would have occurred, what occurred over here with that 50-50 shot. So at this point in time, I'm feeling extremely good about the possibility, right? It's probability and possibility of a very significant move to the upside all the way to almost $32. And that would be, yeah, pretty late in the year, probably more likely December. You know, I don't know exactly how long it would take, but even this guy took several weeks. This would be a very fast move though. And ultimately, yes, it could get there by even early to mid-November. Absolutely, it could. All right, so all of this pain and agony might actually be building up for quite an amazing slingshot to the upside. And that's all I got for you. I went really long on this video. I was trying to keep it short. Hopefully, you guys gleaned a lot from it. Definitely something to be watching in the future. I'm going to do my best to try to clean the chart up, make it a little more accessible. But that's what we've got.